Dmitry Bivol lives a very private life. So it made me wonder, in this private life that he has, obviously, we don't know if he has anything that resembles, let's say, Blueface and Krishan, which, by the way, is a very documented toxic relationship within the hip-hop community. But nonetheless, Bivol's wife was seen in a Russian podcast reacting to the win of Arthur Beterbiev, saying, well, this is karma. Well, in what way? Considering the fact that Arthur did a great job, but it's not like Bivol was really that far away. Some people argue that the fight was 7-5 or 8-4 in the favor of, let's say, Bivol, which means it's a very close fight. And it showed that Bivol is literally one of the all-time greats just based on that performance alone. I really mean that. Because obviously, nobody has ever taken Arthur Beterbiev to the scorecards, but he did. Nobody won the type of rounds that he won against Arthur Beterbiev, but he did. Ultimately, it was the result of Arthur Beterbiev to his favor, whether you can call that hometown advantage because he was in Saudi Arabia, or maybe perhaps one of the judges was friends with Ramzan Kadyrov, who was in attendance during that fight. Either way, we don't know. It's a speculation, but one thing you gotta rest assured is that when it comes to boxing and MMA, there will always be controversial scorecards, and you're never gonna agree with them. So as a result of that, you can't say that this was a screw job. You can't say that this was all planned or the judges were paid or this and that. Look, Eddie Hearn is the one right now screaming travesty. But it is also Eddie Hearn that you have to understand has gone out of his way to dine judges nights before a big fight, or the day before the weigh-ins and this and that, or during a press conference fight week. He has gone out of his way to take care of judges in hotel rooms and giving them fancy dinners and big restaurants to go to. So make of that as you will. You can take any conclusion of that as you want, but that is the facts. And I'm not going to say that Eddie Hearn has done anything like that, but you can't really know one way or the other because you have no proof. Just like with this one, you got no proof that people were screwing the judges in favor of Arthur Beterbiev. It was a very close fight, and this is what I'm trying to tell you guys. When it comes to close fights, it's not always a screw job. You need to understand that. These judges, they have a very hard task, at least within the 36 minutes that they are working. It's a very hard task. You got to figure out who did the most and who did what. If you like the volume, then you're going to go for Bivol. If you like the ringmanship in which Arthur Beterbiev was fighting with aggression, moving him forward, well, then of course you're going to score into his favor. Boxing is subjective, MMA is subjective, and that also includes the realm of judging. Close fights are not always a screw job, and that's literally the hypothesis that I'm trying to make with you guys, that I'm trying to make you understand. Because it's easy to throw conspiracy theories, it's easy to throw certain evidences or lack of, and say, you know what, this is what I saw, this is what it is, this is the reason why they're doing a screw job, because Eddie Hearn goes and dines a bunch of judges the nights before the fights, and he's done that. Now, some will say, well, you know what, maybe it was Turkey El-Sheikh that screwed the whole entire operation because of the fact that he's a Muslim fighter. Well, not so fast. Obviously, we got to take what they're doing for face value, because Turkey El-Sheikh was very upset of the decision. He even went up to Bivol and said, you know what, I think you won that fight, brother. So therefore, we must continue with the rematch. This fight had no rematch clause. And all of a sudden, the Sheikh decided, you know what, we're going to have a rematch, when they didn't have a rematch clause to begin with. You want to know why? because they thought that this fight was going to go one way or the other. It was going to be definitive. It was either going to go into one side of Bivol or it was going to go in the other side of Arthur Beterbiev. One side. But that's not the case. What we got out of this fight was a potential draw. There were announcers and commentators, as soon as the bell rang in the 12th, proclaiming that perhaps maybe there is a draw to this particular fight. The reality is that wasn't the case. They gave it to Arthur Beterbiev. Now, if there were other judges that judged that fight, could it be possible that maybe the fight would have gone another way? Of course. Of course. What about those other Max Holloway and Volkanovski fights? Both those fights could have gone either way in the direction of Max Holloway, but they didn't, because for whatever reason, the judges that showed up that night went out of their way to score it for Arthur Beterbiev. And why? Because of their own subjective view of boxing. What exactly is that? What is their subjective view of boxing? Well, their subjective view of boxing is the guy who moves forward, the guy who fights with more aggression, i.e., general ringsmanship. They gave that to Arthur Beterbiev. But what if you like a much more technical fight in terms of being a counterpuncher, being the type of guy that, let's say, that likes to fight off their back foot? There's a lot of fights that people have won in similar instances with that particular style and trajectory and game planning. One example is Oscar De La Hoya and Felix Trinidad. Oscar De La Hoya was backing up the whole entire fight, and Felix Trinidad was basically doing the same thing that Arthur Beterbiev was doing in that fight, which was what? Move forward. Move forward while Oscar De La Hoya was moving back. And guess who won the fight? It was Felix Trinidad. And I remember that fight vividly in 1999 because I was in my neighbor's house, who, by the way, were a Puerto Rican family, and you would imagine that they were diehard for Felix Trinidad. And they had one relative that was, I believe, an in-law who was El Salvadorian, and obviously he scored the fight for Oscar De La Hoya. But here's another thing a lot of people have to take into consideration. And by the way, I'm going to go into the wife of Bivol in a second, because that's also important to talk about. Because obviously I'm not just a combat channel, I'm not just a sports channel, I'm also a life channel. So we're going to get to digging into that particular instance as well. One thing you got to understand is that when it comes to boxing, when it comes to MMA, it really just depends on who is judging that night. Really. That's really all that it means, especially when it goes to the judges' scorecards. Well, Dana White said it best. Don't leave it in the hands of the judges. Now, I want to say something about that. Sometimes you got to leave it in the hands of the judges, because when you have a high technical fight, what are you going to do? You're going to try to knock them out? Well, what if you can't? That's what we have judges for. So it's a cop-out to say, well, don't leave it in the hands of the judges. Sometimes you have to, because fights that are this highly technical are going to do exactly just that. Okay? They need to be on their P's and Q's, and by the end of the day, no one is right and no one is wrong. The only people that are right or wrong, or the ones that really matter in the right or wrong, are the judges that are there that night. And we have to live with those decisions. Now, were there times where a scorecard was so horrendous that they had to do something about it? One MMA fight that I have in mind is Maldonado versus Fedor Emelianenko. They fought in M1 Global. Maldonado was outboxing Fedor Emelianenko, beating him up in the cage, and then after 3 some odd rounds, they scored the fight, for Fedor, only for months later to reverse that decision because of the horrendous scorecards. And then he eventually gave it to Maldonado, or I believe they made it a no contest, or they just gave the win to Maldonado or something to that extent. But I urge you to look up that fight to reference this particular instance that I'm trying to give you. So not all fights are like Fedor and Maldonado. Not at all. They're not. However, it is important to understand that most fights are predicated on who's judging that night, and you really have to understand that. There is no screw job. There is none of this and that. Both men did great. Bivol did great. Bivol can come back and easily become one of the greatest 175ers. But I also honestly think, in my humble opinion, that there's nobody better than Arthur Beterbiev right now at 175. And in fact, those 12 rounds that he did with him is so critical in the rematch that Arthur Beterbiev is going to have better game planning knowing that he's already been in there with him. So that rematch alone would make it even more dangerous for Bivol, if not even give an opportunity of a finish for Arthur Beterbiev. But nonetheless, Arthur Beterbiev did great. So there is no karma to this situation, and this is where I'm going to get at right now, is his ex-wife, who, by the way, was happy and in glee that he had lost. The reality is this. She didn't understand that he didn't lose anything. He lost the fight, but he gained millions upon millions of dollars for this fight alone. So that's not a win on your part whatsoever. Now, what I said earlier in the beginning of this video, from the very beginning, I said we don't know how toxic this particular relationship is with Bivol and his ex-wife, because good job on Bivol. He doesn't put it out there like Blueface and Krishan, as a reference that I've made earlier. And for those of you that don't know anything about Blueface and Krishan, let me say this. They are a hip-hop couple that has a TV show, a reality TV show, and they are the two most toxic people ever, because let's just be honest about this, right? The urban ghetto community pushes a lot of negativity, and that's the God-honest truth. And I'm telling you this from somebody who has worked with rappers, who's been around rappers, who's been around hip-hoppers, who's been around in the streets, and understands that culture. That's just the God-honest truth. So there's none of that with Bivol. Obviously, this guy is not ghetto, or at least we don't know what contextual ghetto really means in the Russian culture, or if he even espouses these types of things. We don't know enough about him. What we do know is that this woman is taking a celebration of his loss, which in my opinion, I think is a sign of human weakness, a sign of human imperfection and flaws within a person's personality. How is it that you think you've won something or feel good about this guy losing, when in reality he didn't really lose? Because by the end of the day, he only lost to the judges. He didn't lose in his bank account, because he made a lot of money for this fight, and the Saudis were willing to pay him handsomely as a result of it. So he didn't lose anything. What did he lose? He lost a boxing match. He didn't get knocked out. Now, if he got knocked out brutally by Arthur Beterbiev, then maybe you have a case here. But the reality is he didn't get knocked out. He lived to fight another day. He lived to fight another day and another $1 million up ahead in the next fight. And the way that it sounds like, you're just a bitter ex trying to catch clout in an unknown Russian podcast, or I don't know, maybe it's a well-known Russian podcast that was reacting to the fight, but nonetheless, that's the reality of your situation. You will forever just be known as the ex-wife. And then, even worse than that, people will forget about you. Nobody even knows who Muhammad Ali's wives were, although there are some that are well-documented and well-known. The reality is that nobody really remembers them. Nobody even remembers anybody that is in anyone's family other than the actual fighters themselves. Do you think that somewhere down the line, people are going to remember Shane Fury? No. Do you think somewhere down the line that because he's the brother of Tyson Fury, that people are going to remember Tommy Fury forever? Well, maybe. And that is the message that I want to give to Arthur Beterbiev's ex-wife. The only way that Tommy can ever be remembered the way that his brother is, if you go out and you do something great. And I highly doubt that you can do anything other than get on a podcast and act like a bitter woman. Now, a lot of the accusations that she's thrown at Bivol, I mean, look, here's something you got to understand, man. It's none of our business. We don't know what's going on. But like what I've said in most of my podcasts and what I've said in most episodes and videos and things of that nature is that there are no good guys and bad guys in life. They only exist in movies. Whenever there's a conflict between two people, rest assured that both of those people are as responsible over one or the other. And then there are people that are just being provoked into a situation that leaves them no choice but to take certain actions, whether you agree with it or not. And that is all that I have today for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I will see you guys in the next content, the next fights, the next reaction, and everything else in between. Inshallah.